the smoothest man on television. He had it all: fast cars, flashy suits, and every woman in Hollywood wanted to be by his side. Don Johnson owned the 80s, but what happened after the cameras stopped rolling will shock you. How does a man go from primetime royalty to nearly becoming homeless? One minute, he was pulling in huge amounts of money per episode, and the next, he was making desperate deals just to survive. And while the world hailed him for being a legend behind the scenes, Don was living through one of the most heartbreaking realities. But how did he lose it all? And at the age of 75, how's he coping? Once you hear everything he's been through, you'll never look at him the same again, from dirt poor to Hollywood gold. Before we talk about his downfall, you really need to understand just how big Don Johnson was. Back in the 1980s, if you were searching for a style icon, it'd be impossible to not think about Don Johnson in Miami Vice. He was famous for his white suits, pastel shirts, and no socks. He basically invented the look, and it became so famous. By the late 80s, Don was making millions per year. He had hit television shows, chart-topping songs, and even movie deals. He was rich, famous, and on top of the world. Don wasn't just rich, he lived larger than life. He owned multiple luxurious and extremely expensive properties, including a massive ranch in Colorado, a mansion in Hollywood, and a luxury pad in Miami. His car collection had only the big names, think Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches. He was living the American dream, but in an even bigger way. From the company he kept, you could tell he was on another level. We're talking about Jack Nicholson, Barbara Streisand, Melanie Griffith, and even a young Leonardo DiCaprio, who eventually dated his daughter, Dakota Johnson. Life looked perfect for Don until things came crashing down. But before the yachts, the pastel suits, and the million-dollar paychecks, Don Johnson's life looked nothing like a movie star's. In fact, he came from about as far away from Hollywood as you could get. Donnie Wayne Johnson was born on December 15, 1949, in Flat Creek, Missouri, a tiny town in the middle of America. His mom was just 16 years old when he was born, and his dad was only 19. They were basically kids raising a kid while struggling to make ends meet. Money was tight, and life was rough. When Don was still young, his family moved to Wichita, Kansas, where he grew up. Don didn't exactly have a dream childhood. His family was working class, sometimes barely getting by. There were no acting classes, no silver spoon, and no Hollywood connections. To make matters worse, Don actually revealed that both his parents were frequently absent, and they were always stressed. In an interview, he once said, "I had the quinella, maltreatment, and parents who divorced when I was 12 years old, and I was the oldest. I really was unhappy, and I left home at 16. That's right, he left home really early. But even with all the challenges, Don still had that spark. He had that rebel charm, the kind of attitude you can't teach. In high school, he was a bit of a wild one. He got into trouble a lot. He was good-looking, cocky, and full of energy. And guess what? He knew it. So deep down, he wanted more than just small-town chaos. He wanted something huge. In fact, Don insists that being born into that level of poverty and challenges served as a motivation to search for more. He once said, "I had a lot of challenges when I was young. Not physically, but emotionally and psychologically. But I only later discovered that's what lights the fire in creativity, and that those challenges are what is the fuel." Wootis, so how did this Kansas troublemaker turn into a Hollywood star? Well, it all started in high school when he had to take up extra credits, and he joined the drama program. He did it out of necessity, but his teacher saw something special in him, and so he was cast as Tony in West Side Story. It was there that Don caught the acting bug. And let's just say, the stage loved him right back. In an interview, he said, "The moment I stood on stage, it was a drug. The audience was showing me love, which more than made up for the stuff I didn't get at home. And so, after graduating high school, he decided to chase this new dream full-time. He enrolled at the University of Kansas after winning a partial scholarship, where he majored in drama. And this was the beginning of a long and adventurous journey in show business. He eventually left after a while and switched to the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, a place that had trained some of the best in the industry. And that's when the doors began to open. In the late 60s and early 70s, Don began landing small roles in theater and indie films. Nothing big or fancy, but it was definitely a start. One of his earliest films was a very edgy, post-apocalyptic movie called A Boy and His Dog. It became a cult classic, and it put Don on the map, even if just a little. But then, he was still years away from stardom. Through most of the 70s, Don bounced around Hollywood, picking up roles in low-budget films and television guest spots. He hustled his way through the industry. He had to deal with constant auditions, rejections, bit parts, and second guesses. However, in 1984, after more than a decade of being almost famous, it finally happened. Don Johnson got his big break when he landed the role of Detective Sonny Crockett on a brand new crime show called Miami Vice. No one expected it to blow up, but when it aired, it became a cultural phenomenon. Don wasn't just playing a cop. He became a fashion icon, a heartthrob, and a symbol of cool. The slick suits, the fast cars, and the pet alligator made Miami Vice an extremely stylish and unique show that redefined what television looked like. Suddenly, Don Johnson was everywhere, on magazine covers, in music videos, and on talk shows. People weren't just watching Miami Vice, they were obsessed with it. He began earning thousands of dollars per episode. And with 5 seasons of success, he went from hustling for roles to buying mansions and vacationing in Europe. Just like that, the Kansas boy with nothing became one of the biggest stars of the 80s. And Don didn't stop at acting. He dipped into music, too. In 1986, he released a pop-rock album called Heartbeat. And guess what? It actually took off. The title track became a hit, and Don found himself on the Billboard charts. He even performed live concerts and recorded duets with the likes of Barbra Streisand. Was he the best singer in the world? Probably not. But at that point, Don Johnson could do anything, and people would love it. By the end of the 80s, Don Johnson had it all. A hit television show, a booming music career, millions of dollars, movie offers pouring in, and a glamorous lifestyle of yachts, red carpets, and designer everything. His rise to riches story wasn't just impressive. It was the kind of Hollywood fairy tale people dream about. But as we all know, the higher the rise, the harder the fall. And for Don Johnson, the heartbreaking fall was coming. Fast, Don began to make a lot of mistakes and wrong decisions that led to him losing it all. Not just financially, but in his personal life and relationships. Don Johnson's rollercoaster love life. When it comes to romance, Don didn't just date. He made headlines. We're talking about Hollywood's most famous women. Whirlwind weddings, breakups, reconciliations, and even a love story that gave us a movie star daughter. Don Johnson's heart was just as famous as his pastel suits, and sometimes just as chaotic. But let's start at the very beginning. Did you know Don has been married about 5 times to 4 different women? As a matter of fact, 2 of those marriages were so short that they were annulled in a few days. To date, the internet barely knows the identity of these 2 women. However, Don has revealed that one of them was a dancer, while the other was a rich bimbo. It was young, impulsive love. The kind that happens with a lot of rich and famous Hollywood stars. However, things began to get real and interesting in his love life when he met Melanie Griffith. Don and Melanie met each other when they were pretty young on the set of a 1973 film called The Herod Experiment. Their relationship definitely raised some eyebrows even back then, but the two were literally inseparable. By the time Melanie turned 18, they were engaged. They tied the knot in January 1976, and by July of that same year, they were separated. A few months after that, in November, they were officially divorced, all in a matter of months. It was passionate, messy, and totally Hollywood style. But here's the twist. This wasn't the end for Don and Melanie. In fact, they would get back together over a decade later, proving that they truly had something special for each other. In 1989, they remarried, and this time, it came with something even bigger. They welcomed their daughter, Dakota Johnson, who would go on to become a huge star herself. However, unfortunately, even round two didn't last. By 1996, it was all over again, and Melanie later opened up about the struggles that strained their marriage. She said, "He's no angel. He is not easy. It's hard for me to imagine life without him. But we are changing in different ways." Don, on the other hand, revealed that although they had gone their separate ways twice, the love they had for each other was strong. He said, "Some people are just meant to be together. And I think that was true for Melanie and me, so we got married twice. I don't believe that if you love someone that love dies. It changes and becomes something else. So to this day, they've remained close. They co-parented Dakota. And once in a while, you could catch them together, publicly supporting their famous daughter. But let's talk about the other women, because even when Don wasn't married, he was still busy getting in and out of high-profile Hollywood relationships that were so complicated they made headlines. Do you know that Don dated Barbra Streisand? Yes, they were a full-blown couple in the late 80s. They were the definition of a Hollywood power couple. Glamorous, powerful, and unexpected. However, it wasn't meant to last. He also dated Patty D'Arbanville, a model and actress, and she became his longtime girlfriend in the early 80s. They lived together for some years. However, they never got married. They even had a son together, Jesse Johnson, who's now also an actor. That's not all. There's Uma Thurman. In this case, there were rumors, and they were spotted together in the early 90s. However, it was super brief, and it came with a lot of backlash due to the age difference between them. Don also had a thing with Jodie Lynn O'Keefe, and this one really had people talking. Don and Jodie worked together on the movie Nash Bridges, where she played the role of his daughter. However, they soon began dating, and the media went into a frenzy, considering the fact that Jodie was 18 while he was already in his late 40s. They eventually dated for several years, and it definitely came with a lot of backlash. Don didn't shy away from dating younger women, and that just meant plenty of gossip and controversy followed him wherever he went. But after all the wild breakups, makeups, and red carpet romances, Don shocked everyone in 1999 when he finally settled down for real. And this time, it stuck. He married Kelly Flager, a former preschool teacher and socialite from San Francisco. She had a totally different vibe from the flashy Hollywood types he'd previously dated, and maybe that's exactly what he needed to make it work. Kelly was 27 at the time, and Don was 49. But despite the age gap, their marriage worked. They've been together for over 2 decades, with no scandals, no drama, just a quiet and steady love life. Together, they have 3 children. And Don often credits Kelly with grounding him and helping him become a better man. After decades of wild living, she was the calm in his storm. But before she came into the picture, Don was living an extremely wild life. And this lifestyle was what ruined him and caused him his biggest losses. Don struggles with addiction. Let's be honest, when someone rises as fast and as high as Don Johnson did, there's usually a dark side lurking behind the glamour. And for Don, it wasn't just the pressure of fame or the stress of Hollywood. It was something much deeper. Because while the world saw a confident, cool, untouchable star in white linen suits and Ferraris, behind the scenes, Don was fighting demons that nearly destroyed everything he'd built. That's right, the fame turned dangerous, the money got messy, and Don Johnson's life began slipping off the rails. After Miami Vice exploded, Don Johnson was one of the most famous men on the planet. He was rich and handsome and was dating Hollywood's elite. He could literally get anything he wanted. But with that lifestyle came something else. Some call it the negative side of Hollywood fame. Don began partying non-stop, and in the 80s, the party scene wasn't just casual drinks and dancing. It came with alcohol and different kinds of illicit substances. Hollywood was flooded with temptation, and Don didn't hold back. He was working for long hours on different projects, and when he wasn't filming, he was hitting clubs, throwing parties, and numbing the pressure however he could. In interviews years later, Don later admitted that he was introduced to these negative vices through the pressure from Hollywood. He said, "When I was a young man in Hollywood, illicit substances and partying were everywhere, and it was hard to escape. It doesn't become a problem immediately. It takes time, and it led to some poor choices." That's right. His indulgence in these vices and the addiction that followed set the foundation for his poor choices that eventually left him broke and financially crippled. The booze eventually became his escape. It was a way to deal with the anxiety, the fame, the loneliness, and the constant expectations that came with being a Hollywood star. But as anyone who's been there knows, it always starts out as fun, and then it ends in chaos. The drinking and partying started to affect everything: his career, his relationships, and even his health. By the early 1990s, the cracks had begun showing. Sure, Don was still famous. He had even started another successful series, Nash Bridges, but he wasn't the same golden boy. There were rumors of mood swings and erratic behavior, including one highly publicized, controversial conversation he had with morning radio hosts Ron Diaz and Ron Bennington, where he hurled insults and threats at them while intoxicated. He eventually checked into rehab, though the exact details were kept private at the time. But later, he admitted that he had reached a point where he couldn't hide it anymore. The drinking had taken over, and he knew, if he didn't stop, he was going to lose everything: his family, his career, and maybe even his life. It was a hard wake-up call, but it forced him to face the truth. Although his struggle with addiction was a tough battle that led him to make several wrong choices, nothing could have prepared Don for the heartbreaking financial hurdles that lay ahead of him. And it all began with one controversial event that changed everything: the document scandal. By 2002, Don Johnson was no longer the flashy heartthrob he once was. However, he was still famous, still charming, and still flying private jets across the globe. Then suddenly, Don was all over the news again, but this time not for a new television role or red carpet event. Instead, it was for something so disturbing and controversial. Until today, it's still considered one of the most bizarre and unbelievable moments in his career. In December 2002, Don Johnson was flying through Europe. He landed at the German-Swiss border, heading into Germany, the kind of place billionaires and bankers love for very specific and very private reasons. But as usual, customs officers did a routine check of his luggage. What they found in his briefcase was something extremely unusual. In fact, it sent up a massive red flag. German customs officers discovered financial documents connected to bank accounts supposedly worth over $8 billion. These weren't just receipts or tax papers. These were sensitive, high-level financial records, investment paperwork, and documents tied to large international transfers. And this immediately raised the suspicions of the officers. They detained Don for questioning and immediately launched an investigation into possible money laundering. And for a while, things got very serious. A spokesperson for the German Customs Investigation Department told reporters, "There's a reasonable suspicion that Mr. Johnson was working for others. If everything is legal, you don't have to transport documents worth this amount in a car." And so, officials began digging into who the accounts were linked to, where the money was going, and what Don's role actually was. Was he working with international bankers? Was he part of a scheme? Or was he just the face of something darker? Immediately, the news hit the media. It turned into something else entirely. Some tabloids even began floating theories that Don was part of a high-stakes financial conspiracy. Others said he might have been duped and was unknowingly carrying documents for shady businessmen. However, Don immediately made it clear that he had no idea about any wrongdoing. According to him, he was just traveling with business associates, and the documents were part of a film financing deal. He said he wasn't transporting money, just paperwork, and he insisted that nothing illegal had happened. And thankfully, after digging into it, German investigators agreed. They cleared him of any criminal activity and dropped the case a few weeks later. No charges, no arrest, just a whole lot of confusion. But the scandal still stuck, and even though Don Johnson wasn't charged, the damage was already done. The headlines were brutal. The internet went wild, and for a guy who'd already battled different rumors relating to his personal life, this one was just more fuel on the fire. People began asking questions like, was Don secretly broke? Was he getting involved in risky side hustles? Or was he hanging around the wrong people? Suddenly, he wasn't just a former heartthrob with addiction issues. He was now a former heartthrob tied to an $8 billion international mystery. And it didn't matter that he was cleared. In Hollywood, scandals are avoided at all costs, and the whole negative publicity led to Don losing some deals. In fact, this scandal was the beginning of more financial troubles for the actor. Don Johnson's financial woes. Even after surviving the wild money laundering scandal and clearing his name, Don's money problems didn't just go away. In fact, they were just getting started. By the early 2000s, the glamour had faded, and the acting jobs were slowing down. But instead of saving or investing wisely, Don continued spending like the money would never run out. We're talking multiple homes, luxury cars, expensive ex-wives, child support, and the cost of just being Don Johnson. This was a huge mistake, one that would eventually cost him everything. And then came the business ventures. And this is where it started getting messy. You see, Don started investing in things he didn't fully understand, and those poor choices started adding up. And even when it was clear that his income wasn't stable, Don was still living large. His financial foundation began crumbling, and every month brought new bills, new debts, and less cash flow. It was the classic celebrity downfall. Rich guy on the outside, totally broke underneath. However, his biggest final blow was when he almost lost his gorgeous $1 million home in Aspen, Colorado. Don had owned this stunning property for years. This wasn't just a house. It was a 10,000-square-foot mountain paradise tucked away in one of the most expensive zip codes in America. But in 2004, it almost all slipped away from Don's grip. According to court documents, Don Johnson defaulted on a $930,000 loan, and the bank began threatening to seize the house. The situation was so serious that they were literally hours away from foreclosing on the property. However, he was saved at the very last minute, when some kind of mysterious financial backing came through. To this day, it's not fully clear how he pulled it off. Some say it was a mysterious investor. Others believe Don borrowed money from wealthy friends. A few insiders even claimed he sold off personal assets, maybe art, jewelry, or cars, just to make the payment in time. But either way, he narrowly avoided total disaster. But the damage had already been done, and the world now knew that Don Johnson was in real financial trouble. The old millions, not just to one lender, but to multiple creditors. We're talking about the Aspen Valley Hospital, a liquor store, and a law firm, among others. And the fact that a man who once ruled the airwaves was now begging for time to keep his home was heartbreaking. When news of the near foreclosure hit the press, fans were stunned. How does a man who earned tens of millions go broke? How does someone so successful end up one missed payment away from losing everything? The tabloids went wild. Reporters called it the ultimate riches to rags moment. And Don's reputation took several hits. But it didn't stop there. In 2008, Don sued a production company called Riker Entertainment for $23 million, claiming they owed him unpaid profits from his show, Nash Bridges. Why was he suing? Because he desperately needed the money. He argued that the show had earned over $1 billion in syndication and distribution deals, and he wanted his rightful cut. It was a messy and drawn-out legal battle. But at the end of the day, Don won. A jury awarded him $23.2 million, and it was like a financial lifeline thrown right as he was sinking. But by that point, Don had already gone through so many ups and downs, and that money didn't exactly erase his reputation for being reckless with cash. Don't forget the fact that Don had a long history with high-profile women, and those relationships weren't cheap. There were multiple divorces, child support to pay, fancy dinners, and designer everything. By the time Don hit his early 60s, there were whispers around Hollywood that he was done. Studios weren't calling like they used to. The offers were drying up, coupled with the fact that aging in Hollywood can be brutal, especially for someone who once built their career on being the attractive leading man. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was also about relevance. And it seemed Don was fading fast. But just when it looked like he'd hit rock bottom, Don Johnson surprised everyone. He didn't give up. He didn't vanish. Instead, he slowly and smartly made his way back into the spotlight. But this time, it wasn't about being a heartthrob or a leading man. It was about being the wise, cool, older guy who had lived through it all. He bagged roles in shows like Eastbound and Down, appearances in movies, and in 2024, he appeared on a Netflix original film, Rebel Ridge. And that film introduced him to a new generation of fans. And just like that, he had a second wind. Now, at the age of 75, Don Johnson is a survivor. He's not the reckless party boy he once was, or the extremely broke star begging banks to save his home. He's a man who's been through addiction, scandals, lawsuits, and financial ruin, and still found a way to stand tall. He's proud of being sober. He's close with his kids. He's embraced the ups and downs of his journey, and honestly, there's something powerful about that. Looking back, it's clear that his downfall began when he started living a lifestyle his income couldn't support. He had the mansions, the designer everything, and the glitz. But what he didn't have was a solid plan. He never slowed down to build financial security. No rainy day fund, no long-term wealth management. Just fame-fueled spending and blind trust in the wrong people. And once the big checks stopped rolling in, it all caught up to him. But the good thing is, he may have lost millions. He may have made a mess of things. But Don Johnson is still here. And guess what? He's cooler than ever. But what do you think? Did Don Johnson truly learn from his past? Or is there still more drama waiting to unfold? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you love juicy deep dives into celebrity lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new video.